we observe consistent evidence of a large negative birth order effect within families in a variety of outcomes, in a variety of developed countries, not so much in developing countries. Obviously, what all these things came from was the very well-known quantity-quality trade-off. All this birth order literature fits very closely with the Becker theory that there is a trade-off between the quantity and the quality of children. While this is a very, very well-known theory, one thing that it's also important to notice is that when we look at developed countries, the evidence is somehow mixed. And I mentioned there are a few papers that show that, at least for children outcomes, when you use arguably external shock to family size, that the outcome of the children don't seem to decrease in inequality in the way one would expect if this was kind of a textbook example of the quantity-quality trade-off. There is Cáceres del Piano for the US, Angris and co-author of a paper with different ways of identifying this for Israel, and Black-de-Verse and Salvanes use the birth order as a way of potentially explaining why we will observe a quantity-quality trade-off and a correlation, but not then in a causal way. But it is also important to frame what we're going to do here is to know that along the path of development, and that is a very interesting, very clear Galore paper there, we should expect, or we could expect as well, to see this quantity-quality trade-off. People become richer over time as the countries develop, and that has an impact on the type of choice that they make. In this case, the empirical evidence is definitely more limited, but within its limitation, a bit more consistent. And there are papers for the 19th and early 20th century in the US that show a very clear quantity-quality trade-off. Becker looks at it for mid-19th century Prussia. There is some evidence for Ireland as well. And within this more limited set of evidence, along the development path, there seemed to be a more clear quantity-quality trade-off. So what we're going to try to address in this paper is whether we observe something similar with the birth order effect. Do we have a birth order playing a role in modulating this relationship, or do we observe it in absence while countries are developing, or what is the role of this very well established for developed countries effect of order of birth? For this, we're going to pick up an historical setting in which we're going to have, obviously, growth. We're going to have some changes to structural composition, and we're going to see something that looks a bit like a fertility transition as well. Although the data that we have here is a bit more on references only. We're going to use a within family setup that our data allows to see whether this within family source of inequality varies by family background, by location, with some difference that I'll explain in a moment, and also over time. So finally, in addition to contribute to understanding a bit better whether there is a modulation by birth order on this quantity-quality trade-off, or if this birth order effect appears as well in a setting in which the quantity-quality trade-off appears as well a bit more consistently, we have the birth order, what we call a birth order puzzle, that we mentioned before, is that the developed birth order effect, or the birth order effect in developed countries, is very clear, negative and consistent. In developing countries, not so much. So we're going to try to see if there is anything we can say there, in the sense that these countries in which we may see a positive birth order effect, should we expect or should we not that they are going to converge to the type of birth order effect that we observe in developed countries. So the setup that we're going to use here is looking at the Netherlands from mid-19th century to mid-20th century. To be precise, for people born between 1938 and 1922. So this is a graph of the Dutch GDP per capita from the Madison Data Project. And what we can observe in real terms is that there is change in economic conditions, in the sense that the country is becoming richer and richer. One thing that should be noted is that the Netherlands was not a poor country by any means at the beginning, for example. They had their golden age before example. They benefited from the Atlantic trade. So the level of development pre-industrial revolution was pretty high, all things considered. Obviously, they have the northern provinces that took more advantage of trade and were hence richer and more developed. And they have other parts that were a bit more agriculture. But as nothing comes for free, being relatively developed to begin with is probably one of the reasons that we're quite the latecomers to the Industrial Revolution. They were by no means as early adopters as their neighbor Belgium was. And over this period, we're going to see not only high growth, but, and I think this is the next graph, also a decline in the share of people working in agriculture. This is data from a different project that I have in the similar setting. So if you look at all the marriage records and divide people that are in agriculture in any shape or form, we go from around 30%, which is not terribly high for the time, because the Netherlands already had some industry and a lot of trade. But over the period that we're going to look at, goes still around half of that size. So this is a period in which the GDP is growing, the economy is changing, and along the economy that is changing, we observe a population expansion that tends to come along with those events. Using data from the Dutch census, what we have is that obviously population rapidly increased, but mostly due to a reduction in mortality. Because along this expansion, we observe less and less births per 1,000 women. Also, along the period, halving in size. So we go from 25 births per 1,000 women to 12.5 within less than a century. So this is a period over the Dutch history that, although the golden age was already past, there were a lot of things that were changing. We have higher GDP, less agriculture, moving to manufacturing, to industry. We have quite a bit more population, less births, and so on. So I think as far as we can tell from the evidence that we have for the time, kind of a pretty standard development, path of development there. Yes, Carl?
Yeah, so just curious, do you know, do you have similar trends for child mortality? Anything? Any kind of suggestion? Because I would be imagining they are drastically changing over this period.
So the evidence that we have, or that we can have from this data, is not terribly good, because there is very little on death records. But what we can gather from the data that we have from other evidence, we also see a decline in child mortality as well.
Okay, all right, thanks.
From our data, I'm a bit skeptical with the data that we had, because what we observe is like an increase at the beginning and then a decline, which suggests to me that maybe things that were not digitized were not random. But from my reading of the other literature is that there was quite a bit of a decline in child mortality as well, not only in life expectancy, but also in child mortality.
Okay, thank you.
So this is the setup that we have, and this is the data that we're going to be using. What we're going to be using is this so-called historical sample of the Netherlands. That is a representative sample of individuals from the Netherlands born between 1812 and 1922. The data that we're going to use came via the Dutch civil registries. I think they started recording things even before the French drove by with Napoleon. So they have quite good, from the early 19th century, they have quite good registries for birth and marriage, and I believe death as well, although as far as we are concerned, as far as this sample is concerned, they are only partially digitized and potentially, as I was mentioning to Carl, not randomly digitized or not randomly included here. So most of our information is going to come from births and marriage records. So what the Institute for Social History in Amsterdam did is, with these registries that have been digitized over time, take a sample, a representative sample of research persons, and link these people to all the relatives that they can find. They link them to parents, siblings, children, spouses of children, virtually anybody that you can find around this research person. And I think they select potentially at the beginning 0.75% of the total population, and then maybe 0.5 as the population got larger. What is very useful for us, for our setting, is that this information is family linked. You can have parents linked with all their children, and that allows us to do some within family study. It can allow us not only to compare firstborn with secondborn in overall, but within each family. What we're going to be comparing, and I'll go back to that, we're going to be making comparisons between adult brothers.
Sorry, Anna, just a quick question. So does it link to people who are in the household at the same time as the individuals, or does it follow the brothers when they leave the household?
They follow everybody as far as they can.
Okay.
So they, I think the sample was taken out of, I believe, birth certificate. So we'll have a random sample of births, and they match these people with their parents via their marital records, with their siblings via the marital records of the parents and the birth records of the siblings. But they can also match them with their own children over time.
Right.
So,
okay.
Yeah.
That's really cool, because normally these data sets just track people over time, and then you just see their relationships as people move in or out the household. But it sounds good.
Yeah, the advantage is that any record that they can find of these people over their lifetime, except deaths, are supposed to be within the sample. The not so nice thing is that obviously you need to have some relationship with the registry to be recorded. Mm-hmm. You either need to be born, be married, or have a child, or have a child getting married.
Okay, thanks.
So that is, I think that's mostly the 4 cases in which we're going to observe people. Mm-hmm. There was another question?
Yes, I was just wondering, so right now it looks like the data was linked at a sort of family, sort of what we would see kind of as in the developed world as kind of the unitary family of sort of 1 or 2 parents and children. But, you know, I think it might be fair to assume that, well, in developed countries currently, and also in some developing contexts currently, and also perhaps at the time, the unitary family was a much larger entity. And so if you think about sort of the resources for mouth to feed, it might not be that it's only sort of how many siblings you have above you, but also how many cousins you have in the household that are older than you, and so on and so forth. Is there any way that, well, just how do you think about that problem, I guess?
True. So one thing that they include sometimes that was a bit surprising to me when I was first addressing the data is sometimes they had individuals that were in the household, like servants or other people that were around that were not necessarily a relative of the research person. That was also included there. The issue with this type of data is that you need to appear in a registry as part of the family, let's say. So it is, and obviously it is, you may appear, for instance, even if you're not a relative, if you're living with the family and you're potentially a witness in a marriage, something along those lines. Excuse me. But if there are other people in the household that do not appear in a registered event, we will not observe them. That is totally true. One thing that I will mention is that if parents remarry, we will observe all the children. So at least if particularly in an area at the beginning of the period in which maternal mortality might be high, this is something that one can at least can address.
Okay, cool, thanks.
So along those same lines, let me talk briefly about sample selection and a few issues that we try to address within this sample selection. We're going to cut the first part of our sample up to 1838. That is the year of Dutch Civil Code that apparently was in operation for quite a long time, until relatively recent. And the reason we do that is that even though apparently the Napoleonic Code that came before that already has some something along the same lines, in this civil code it's clear that if someone were to die without a will, the remaining assets or the state will be divided equally. In the sense that obviously, it's my understanding that in the Netherlands, people are free to write the will however they like. But it seems that as far as the rule can collect what was standard, there was not a primogeniture set up in the Netherlands, at least from this point onwards. So that's where we're going to cut the first part of our sample. There's a caveat there that it was in some regions was working a bit different. Some Saxon regions I can come back to this later, but if we drop those from our analysis, nothing changes. So we are in any case dropping the first few years of the sample. We are restricting our sample to individuals of family with at least 2 brothers, because we are comparing men. The reason we're comparing men is because obviously we have a lot of women without an occupation, and it was not clear what was the selection into reporting an occupation. Depending on your status, you might be more or less willing to report an occupation when you're married and when you're having a child. So the selection into reporting an occupation is a bit unclear at best. Some people say it was not very well regarded for women to have an occupation. So even if they did have one, they may not have reported it. And also the setting of our data makes it a bit unclear. We can actually match individuals to their spouses. Very, very clear, because links are defined with respect to the research person. So if the research person has 2 brothers and the brothers have two wives, we don't know necessarily which brother goes with which wife. So that's why we restrict our sample to men. We're also going to ask, obviously, that brothers and the father had a valid occupation. There's going to be our outcome of interest. So we can also do some analysis by family background. And it is worth noting that people are going to be missing in our sample if they died before reaching adulthood, if they remain unmarried and childless, or even if they didn't, if they did not report an occupation, or the occupation that they report was not properly digitized and matched. That might have been some misspelling, even though I think the people that match the occupations with the classification that we're going to use did a rather good job, but these things may happen. So with all these caveats on the sample selection, we're going to have information on the year of birth, gender, municipality. We're going to have information on religion. And importantly, obviously, we're going to have information on occupation, which is going to be the outcome that we're going to be using. It is worth to note that obviously occupation is self-reported. So this occupation is going to be self-reported, assuming that corresponds, given that maybe the guy in the registry knew you were from a small place. It might be worth noting that it should be similar. And if we have individuals with multiple occupations, that can happen. You would report an occupation when you're married, and then you have a couple of children, report occupations. When you register your children, they got married, you again have to report occupation. There can be people that change occupations. So for this analysis, we're going to choose the best. If we choose the median occupation, according to the categorization I'm going to talk in a minute, nothing changes, or results carry through. So let me talk briefly about what we do with these occupations and how we use them, and before getting to the results. So the occupations that were reported in these registries were linked to this HISCO classification, this historical HISCO that I believe is one of the standard occupation classifications that exist. They have a historical version of this. They go up to 5 digits in this classification, and it's linked to several classificational rankings, usually coming from more the history, sociology side of things than economics. So the first one we're going to use is this HISClass, this International Historical Class Scheme for Occupations, that has 13 categories that we're going to divide in two categories instead of using the 13 that they provide. As a very clear division, we're going to divide them in non-manual and manual occupations. And there are a few of the occupations or the type of classes that are included in non-manual occupations and in manual occupations. The idea with this is to be able to obtain a very clear interpretation of our results, and also something that is obviously very important as socioeconomic outcomes or socioeconomic status, broadly understood, has to do. So having a non-manual occupation, it's obviously much better for your socioeconomic status than having a manual occupation. And this probability of holding a non-manual occupation give us a very clear interpretation of the effect of the order of birth. The second classification that we're going to use is this HISCAM, this historical CAMSIS, that is a widely used rank based on a range of historical records. This HISCAM is supposed to provide not only an ordinal classification, but a cardinal classification, and uses relatives and friends to estimate social distance between occupations. Given that we're looking within family and using relatives and studying the distance between relatives, using a classification that uses the distance between relatives to measure the distance is a bit strange to me, or unclear to me whether we'll be measuring the same thing. So we're going to use this historical CAMSIS to build a classification or a measure of the occupation quality. What we're going to do is use the ranking, but not the distance. We're going to get the ranking of occupations, so kind of the ordinal classification, and use this to calculate the share of any individual's cohort that is ranked below that individual, or below the classification or the occupation that individuals hold. So this will give us an occupation percentile or an occupational rank. The higher your rank is, the better off you are with respect to your cohort. So it's also help us a bit as well, accounting for a changing in occupational composition. So the probability of holding a non-manual occupation and this occupation percentile are going to be our two variables of interest, or the two ways we're going to capture your adult outcome, or the adult outcome of the people in our sample. Carl, yeah.
So I was just wondering about migration and rural urban distinctions that are happening over this time period as well. It's a long time period, right? And there's well, a lot of movement into the cities. I'm just thinking whether lumping together the rural and urban version of the manual might miss something.
So good point. I will let me first talk about migration in general, and then about the putting the manual together. So in addition to being a bit more developed than the average country before our sample, or at the beginning of our sample, the Netherlands was also pretty urban already. So we observed a bit of an increase in the number of people going to cities. So a bit of an increase in how many people observe in a city rather than in a rural area. But the increase is not so much. It's not so high as you would observe in the UK. So we have a bit of migration, but it's a bit attenuated by the fact that a lot of people for this setup were already living in cities. So actually in the 1849 census, that actually we're going to use to divide cities or municipalities into cities and non-cities, we already have 35% of the population living in cities, and goes up by 10 percentage point by the end of our sample. So it's a bit of an increase that is not, in my understanding, don't really know so much about British history, but my understanding is that in the UK, that migration was much larger.
Okay.
So the other thing that I would say is that we're going to look differently for between cities and other municipalities, and also that we are going to look for a different type of regions. So there will be regions that will be more rural, and there are regions that are more urban in general. So we're going to do both differentiation. We're going to look at different regions. Obviously, Holland versus the South is going to be a very clear distinction. But even within the South, we're going to have things that definitely look like cities and have looked like cities for centuries at this point. And we're also going to look whether that is different there.
Okay, great.
So just some statistics very briefly. We're going to have an average order of birth of 4, with below 2 older brothers. One thing that I will mention is that we appear to have a bit positively selected sample, in the sense that the share of fathers with non-manual occupations is a bit higher than the share of individuals with non-manual occupations. So we have 24% of all parents with non-manual occupations, and below 20% for siblings, or for the individuals that we're looking at the outcome. So that might be the case, but we are picking up more people from positively selected families because the way the sample was selected on research people. If research people have more children, we're going to see more of those type of families. But we're also, the same thing with cities, we're also going to do some heterogeneous effects there to see. We have around 35% of people looking in municipalities, and we also have some difference by region, religion, and so on. So yeah, let's get finally to the interesting stuff. These are based on a strategy. We're going to see. We're going to have an outcome for individual I in family F, in cohort C, in region R. There are at this stage 11 regions in the Netherlands, and our occupational outcome are going to be the 2 that I just defined. We're going to have a measure of order of birth. At the beginning, it's going to be linear. We'll play around a bit with that. We're going to have some controls. That is going to be the age gap with your immediately preceding sibling, and also the year in which your occupation was measured. As we measure the occupations at different points, marriage of children, birth, we may observe people at different ages, and that may give us a different, imperfect measure of what was their lifetime outcomes. So we're going to control for that as well, because someone in which we observe their occupation at 30 might be very different than someone we observe their occupation at 50. And then we're going to control for family, in this case, father occupations, father fixed effects, cohort fixed effect, and region fixed effect. And we're going to have our standard errors cluster at the family level to allow for correlations there. I see a hand raise.
Yeah, sorry. I was just wondering, what's the rationale behind including this XI-FCR? Because it seems to me that it's an intermediate variable. It's intermediate outcome in the sense that it's jointly determined with the birth order. So that parameter, that gamma there is probably going to be highly correlated to the beta. Or so what's the rationale here between XI-FCR?
So The year the occupation was measured, I think is mostly to capture a feature of our data that unfortunately we cannot do much about, is that we only observe people when they go to the registry. If they don't go to the registry, we don't observe them, and they may go to the registry at different points. The age gap with the sibling, I do agree that this could be a variable that is also determined by a type of family and by the same things that determine order of birth. My surprise with these type of variables is that they never make a difference. We could have it there, we can take it out, and it really doesn't matter. It's a way of capturing maybe that birth order may capture something different if you're very close by, because the competition for resources is higher than if you're far apart, because the competition of resources might not be so important. You're needing different resources from your family when you're growing up. This could be seen as capturing part of these differences. The fact is that it actually never made a difference. It doesn't make a difference here, and it didn't make a difference in a different paper when we're looking at early life outcomes, which in that case are obviously much more surprising to me. But the rationale is that this can capture this difference in something that might be driven the birth order effect, that is this competition for resources.
Okay, but if it makes no difference, then it's a lot safer to just leave it out, since it's possibly endogenous.
Yeah. Yeah, we may as well. We could as well leave it out. It doesn't take away or variation. It's very puzzling to me that it does not make a difference, but that's. So yeah, this is gonna be our setup, and in this baseline result, I'm gonna show both the OLS without the father fixed effect and the fixed effect with the father fixed effect. One thing that is pretty common in this birth order literature is when you take away the fixed effect, things don't change as drastically as one would expect. And this is true for a variety of settings. I don't really have a good explanation of why, but I think it's a good exercise to show both. What we observe, particularly when we include father fixed effect, when we're comparing within brothers of the same father, is that even at this time, even with these outcomes, we observe a negative birth order effect. The later you're born in the family, the worse your adult outcomes are. It is also important to notice that the effect is not overly large. The effect, even if it's significant, the effect is in size is rather small. So here we're looking at compared to the average, I think this probability of non-manual occupation, we're looking at 3.5%, give or take, with the occupational percentile. I think if you were to do some kind of intergenerational elasticity regression, it will be similar to dropping your father down by 2 percentiles. So the effect seems to be there, but it is not overly large. So we observe brothers born later in the family performing worse. Each additional individual will make them perform worse and worse, but by a relatively small amount, at least as far as we can capture by these outcomes. Given the time that we're looking at, one thing that it is that can happen is that we observe differences or some heterogeneous effect depending on whether you have older brothers or older sisters.
Hi, Anna.
Yep.
I think both Carl and I have noticed something. Are you trying to show us your estimates?
Yes.
So we're still on the estimation strategy slide.
Okay.
That's what it is showing us.
Okay.
Can you maybe try unsharing your screen and then share it back again?
Yeah. That definitely can do.
Yeah, at first I thought you were just giving us a preview of the results, but then
I don't know my results by heart that much.
there we go. Great.
No.
Thanks.
So these are indeed the results I was talking about. We observe quite precise effects, but negative effects, but the size of the effect is relatively small. So as I mentioned, this 0.007 is around 3.6% of the average, and the other one for the percentile for the fixed effect, that will be similar to the effect of having a father whose occupational percentile is 2 percentiles lower, I believe. The next thing that I wanted to show you is whether there is an heterogeneous effect depending on if the salients that you have in front are competing potentially for the same resources than you are. And then your order of birth can be due to having older brothers or to having older sisters. And when we look at the fixed effect, it seems rather clear that what matters is how many brothers you have in front of you. The number of older brothers has a negative impact in the probability of you holding a non-manual occupation or the quality of that occupation, while the number of older sisters seems to, if anything, play a smaller role, but in any case, not a significant role in here. So it might be that it's a male preference, or there are different types of resources, given that we only have men in this sample, there might be competing for different type of resources. Yes, Stephen?
Yes, sorry. Could you help us just for the interpretation of the size of this parameter? Because without really knowing kind of this HISCO ranking, can you like give us some sort of scale of what this means?
So your probability, if you look at the linear birth order, the average probability of holding a non-manual occupation was a bit below 20%. And this decline the probability by 0.7, which if I made my numbers correctly, which is always an assumption here, this will be around 3.5% change. As the occupational percentile goes, that will be going down by a bit more than half a percentile, which is more or less the same effect that in a mere correlation thing you expect to have if you have a father, if you are in a intergenerational elasticity, a very standard regression with the same control as here. I think this will be double the size of having a father that is 1 percentile below. Something along those lines. So it's not huge by no means, but it is negative and it appears to show up already in this setting.
Okay, thanks.
So the next thing that I would like to do is go fully nonlinear, or at least add a set of birth order dummies so one can see exactly what is happening here. And unfortunately, what is happening here is that the precision that we have with this data is limited. And obviously, when we do this, the more down you go in the order of birth, the more imprecise results become here. So if anything, one can gather from this this graph that it can be the case that the difference between the second and the first, which will be the first couple of bullet points for both outcomes, is if anything a bit higher than what happens later on till we go to the 6 or so and we enter the land of no precision. So what we're going to do, instead of carry this rather imprecise estimation around, is having one that is a bit more flexible, in the sense that we're going to allow for a firstborn effect, and then a linear trend in birth order. And for completeness, we're also going to add a lastborn effect. If there is a firstborn effect, because having less competitions or being the one child, the only child for a while, is beneficial, something like that may as well occur when you're the last one. So this is what we can find when we make the specification a bit more flexible, not fully flexible, unfortunately, but a bit more flexible. What we observe is that indeed there is a firstborn effect. If you are the firstborn of your family, your probability of holding a non-manual occupation is quite a bit bigger, and the average quality of your occupation as far as your percentile goes is also better. For the probability of having a non-manual occupation, this is the only thing we observed and do not have really enough precision to have a birth order effect anymore, although if anything, that will be smaller in size or a lastborn effect. When we look at the occupational percentile, that obviously take advantage of much more variation, not only around the cutoff for manual or non-manual, but also in other parts of the distribution, we observe that we have a firstborn child effect. If you are the first one, you are better off. After that, you're still losing a bit as you get later and later in the family. If you were the last one, you managed to catch up. Almost three siblings have taken advantage of being the last one. Okay, again, not huge effect by any means, but it looks like even at this stage, within each family, resources, as far as we can capture by occupational percentile, were distributed in a bit unequal way. I don't know if there is a question or if there is a leftover hand. Oh, there are questions now. Yeah.
So I think it's a bit of both. There was a leftover hand, but then there's sort of a question popping up in the chat about some uncertainty about what exactly the HISCO ranking is, what sorts of occupations rank higher or lower, whether the effects are different, sort of moving from different parts of the occupational distribution. And yeah, Carl also asked sort of how stationary the occupation distribution is, which I assume it wouldn't be if you're sort of talking over the whole 19th century, but I guess the percentiles would be stationary by construction, right?
Yes, that is correct. So obviously, the probability of having a non-manual occupation, that is going to change over time. The country develop, a lot of more people appear towards the top of the distribution than towards the bottom. So that is going to change. The occupational percentile by construction is stationary because it captures the share of your cohort that holds an occupation that, according to a ranking, to this SysCam ranking, is worse than yours. So if you're in the middle, if you have a median occupation, you leave 50% of the population down, or you may leave 20% of the population down, or 80% of the population down, but the population being your own cohort. So this kind of by construction is stationary over time. We also control for cohort fixed effect, but that definitely helped us with the changing occupational composition of the Dutch population over time. So I don't know if I have addressed all the questions. So from the classifications that we use, we only use the ranking. So we don't use, in a way, the cardinality of the occupation.
Thanks, Anna. That answers my question perfectly.
Sure.
Thanks.
I think with all these things, I have the same problem that some of the people seem to be having, is that when you look at the ranking on its own, it's very hard to interpret what you're finding. And I think particularly in a setting like that, there is a value of being able to put in context the size of your estimates and so on. So that's why we went this semi-different route. So yeah, let me now talk a bit about the effect of family background. The same way we have whether you have a manual or non-manual occupation and your occupational rank, we have the same thing for your father. What we're going to see now is that whether having a father that was better off, it being having a non-manual occupation or having a higher rank, affects how the order of birth modulates your outcome, or the correlation between your order of birth and the quality of your occupation. So in this case, we only have here fixed effect estimations. What we observe in the first one is a simple linear specification with order of birth. And we interact this with your father having a non-manual occupation when we look at non-manual occupations, the probability of a non-manual occupations, and with your father percentile when we're looking at the percentile. And what we observe here overall is that children that are in families that are better off have a larger difference with their older siblings, with their older brothers, that children from families that are not so well off. If the father had a non-manual occupation, we observe almost double the difference than if the father had a manual occupation. The way I interpret these trends means, like, probably fathers that had manual occupations or whose occupation was not of very high quality did not have the ability to make any different investments. Now, you need to be potentially rich enough to be able to make some additional investment in some of your children and not in the rest. When we separate between older brothers and older sisters, we observe very consistently what we observed before. Nothing happening for older sisters. They either don't get any resources or need different resources. And the same thing that we observed before for older brothers. The better off your family is, the higher is going to be the difference that we observe between a younger sibling, a younger brother, and an older brother. And for the more flexible specification, let me show you a graph that potentially doesn't do a very good job in presenting the results. So what we have in the x-axis is the father occupational percentile, and we have fixed the trends to be linear. So the more linear effect that you see in the diamond shape is the birth order. So there we observe no effect, no differential effect of your father having better occupation. If we look at the firstborn, we observe that the better of your father is, the higher is that beneficial effect of being the firstborn. On the other hand, being the lastborn is particularly beneficial if your family is not very rich. If your father had an occupation that didn't have a very high quality, a very high ranking in this way. So if your father had an occupation that only live below him 10 or 20% of his cohort, the last child is going to benefit more than if the father was later on in the or higher up in the occupational distribution. This is fixed to be linear, but when we allow it to be nonlinear, we observe pretty much the same thing. If anything, a bit less variation on the tail, so maybe 10 to 20th percentile is the same thing, and then it goes down, and then it becomes flat again, 80, 90, 100. So it's flatter there, but all in all, the same story. Firstborn are better off, particularly if they're from well-off families. Lastborn are better off, mostly if they are from not so well-off families. One thing that might be happening, one story here, in addition to the inheritance that I mentioned before, is that even though you all may get the same money when your father passes away, those that are born earlier in the family actually get past the occupation of the father. There is some intangible knowledge that is passed, and is passed mostly to the firstborn. So we are looking here at the probability of holding exactly the same occupation as your father. And this with quite a level of detail, but if we allow for a group of occupation to be defined as the same occupation, we observe the same thing. So what we observe here is that indeed, when you're the firstborn or you're born earlier in the family or early among the brothers, you do indeed observe a higher probability of holding exactly the same occupation as your father. So it's a transmission of occupations that might be driven this result. However, what doesn't really fit with that story is when you look at a bit more flexible specification, depending on the quality of that occupation, which occupation is your father passing through you, this transmission of occupations seem to be happening at the bottom of the distribution. If you're the firstborn with a father that didn't have such a good occupation, you're more likely to get the same, or to end up working in exactly the same occupation than if you are, your father has an occupation that's a bit better. And let me mention that this is robust to us dropping the farmers here. Yes, there's a question?
Yeah. So sorry. So what does that mean for the at the bottom of the occupation distribution for fathers? What does that mean for the younger siblings? Because sort of, if you're getting an occupation that's at like the lowest 10%, which is the same as your father's, but was at the lowest 10% of the occupation distribution, and it's showing that for younger siblings it's getting even worse than that, then basically what's happening in the sample, most of these younger siblings just don't have jobs, or they just basically. So I would have expected that actually it was kind of, there was no effect at the bottom of the distribution and a pretty strong effect at the top. So I'm trying to understand why it's stronger at the bottom.
So one thing that might be happening is that people that have better occupation can provide their children with either education or better alternatives so that they can have, even having a different occupation, they can have a better occupation.
Okay, so
those that are at the bottom may only be able to transmit their occupation, and their occupation turns out to be not very good.
Okay, so this is relative. This is not in sort of it's relative to each group. I can't go through sort of thinking about all of these parameters as there are a lot of interactions. But is the parameter then sort of the difference relative to the? Yes, I guess it is. I'm sorry. Now I'm seeing it. Sort of it's a difference relative to the higher, better doing families. Is that right?
Yeah. So, for instance, the effect of one additional sibling for those families that are not doing very good will decrease your probability of having the same occupation as your father by 1.4 percentage points, I believe. This will only be half of that for those that are better off. Either your father can give you their occupations more times, or can make more of you with the same occupation, or your siblings go to similar occupations, but that they are every time a bit less quality.
Okay, thanks.
So while the first part of this table may seem that this transmission of information of intangibles within the family may explain a bit the order of birth, what happens is that it is actually happening in the part of the distribution that is not the one mostly driving our results. So that might be obviously things that are transmitted within the family, but the exact occupation or occupation knowledge doesn't seem to be one of them. So let me briefly talk about location. This is a map of the Netherlands. So what we're going to do here is divide the Netherlands according to their level of development. They're at this stage 11 provinces. So we're going to take North and South Holland. They're the ones in the darker gray as urban provinces. We're going to take Zeeland in the south, and I think it's Groningen and Drenthe, maybe, up in the north as some midpoint. We're going to call them modern agricultural. They did a lot of agriculture, but a bit more with a market focus. While the rest of the provinces that are here in a light green, or in a light gray, are going to be just plain rural areas. The second thing we're going to do is within each of these provinces, there are more urban areas and there are more rural areas. So we're going to look at cities versus, as I mentioned before, cities versus non-cities. So what we observe here is that particularly in the probability of holding a non-manual occupation, doesn't seem to be a lot of variation. So the birth order that goes without interaction will be the one that occurs in more urban areas, North Holland and South Holland in this case, and then we interacted with modern agriculture and rural regions. As the probability of having a non-manual occupation goes, we don't really observe a lot of variation. We're a bit in a land of, maybe we're losing power here. The only place in which we observe, and it is true that we might have more variation as the occupation quality measure goes, is that the firstborn effect seems quite a bit concentrated in the richer regions. For the rest, we cannot really tell so much. And following up on the question that I had at the beginning, when we look at cities versus non-cities, we also don't find a huge amount of evidence that it was concentrated in cities. This is not very surprising potentially for non-manual occupations, because maybe non-manual occupations are concentrated by nature in particularly at the beginning of the sample in more rural areas, but this may change over time. But even with the occupational percentile that can capture a bit more, we don't really seem to observe a lot of variation on being concentrated on richer cities. So I know I'm probably way out of time. Let me just mention that there is a very clear divide in religion, and this is the share of Protestants in 1849, probably. The darker it is, the more Protestants there are, for historical reasons, the Spanish being involved. Below the river is very clearly much more Catholic, above the river that ends up in Zealand, in this island-looking part in the south, is much more Protestant. They have their own Bible Belt around with a higher concentration of Protestants. What we observe here is that Protestant individuals and Protestant regions that are also richer tend to show a bit more concentration of the birth order effect there, particularly the firstborn. Note that southern regions have less population, so we have less people in the Catholic regions, less people being Catholic and less people in the Catholic regions. I think maybe we're something like 80-20, if I remember from my descriptive statistics before. So we might be losing a lot, but within the Protestants and within the Protestant regions, there seem to be, particularly the firstborn effect, seem to have a beneficial impact. You're the firstborn, you are on average better off than your brothers that came after you. The last thing that I will mention is that we look at some effects over time. What we do is regressing very flexibly or specification interacted with the year of birth. And then we take these estimates in order to fix our standard errors and regress them at trend. Whenever we do that, or whenever we plot them over time, we don't find the solution of the birth order puzzle that we were looking for. Is that these things was pretty absent at the beginning and goes over time to increase, but observe a bit more mixed bag of things. It seems to be potentially increasing in urban regions, but mostly on the firstborn. Non-urban regions seem to be a bit more on the decline, particularly with this lastborn having some beneficial effects. But all in all, potentially also due to the characteristic of our data, we cannot really observe a very clear trend over time, which, given how many changes happened over that period of time, on its own, to me, is quite remarkable, and hence what I'm talking about, mostly an old result here, is that the difference that we observe between developing and developed countries, it is unlikely that they're going to go away as countries develop. It's not that the developing countries have not reached a steady state, in many quotations, many quote marks, and they will, as they develop, and they will go back to the negative birth order effect that we have been observing in developed countries for quite a while now. But there might be something else in the preference structures that might be different as well. Not only GDP growth, because we observe a lot of high GDP growth over this period, and our effects are quite stable over time. And I think I will wrap up here in case there are any questions. Still, because I believe I went way over time.
No, actually, we've still got a good 13 minutes or so left for questions, so I think you're sort of right on it, Anna.
Okay, good.
Stephen, I think, has his hand up.
Sorry, that was a mistake. I didn't put it down from earlier.
Okay. Are there any questions for Anna?
I think Carl had a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just as you were saying at the very end, Anna, doesn't the religion aspect supports what you're saying, doesn't it? That you do find differences between religious groups, so it could be, related to deeper held preferences rather than anything to do with development.
Yeah, definitely. So there is a bit of literature, and that's why we end up looking at religion that claims. I think it might be also a bit of literature by Sasha Becker that looks at the effect of being Protestant and particularly literacy, since Protestants had to or needed the ability to read the gospel on its own, and that seems to have kickstart a strive for literacy in some Protestant regions as well. And what we find in is consistent with, obviously those regions are richer, that should not be discounted, but there might be something that is not exclusively economic development here.
And then, sorry, I had another question if nobody else is going to jump in, just a quick one. So I was trying to get my head around what you were doing with the stuff around transmission of the father's occupation. I thought that was really interesting, but I was trying to get my head around what you were asking, and if so, so was it kind of looking whether, well, would another way of asking the same question be, would if you found a family where somebody in the household or one of the brothers had the occupation transmitted to them, is the question then, what was their birth order and how are the other brothers doing relative to their father's occupation?
So there might be a way in which we can merge both things. What I was trying to go with that check is we have people that are born earlier in the family that are doing better, particularly the firstborn. And obviously we cannot measure any childhood investment or inheritance or anything like that. But one thing that parents have to transmit is their know-how on their occupation. And they may be, or results might be driven by the fact that they choose to transmit this to the older son.
Okay.
There might be, I think that's something we definitely should try to see whether there is a way of trying to account for this. But at the end of the day, we do observe that more early born or firstborn have the exact same occupation as the father. So that might have been some transmission there. But that transmission happens mostly among families that have the smaller birth order effect.
Okay.
Rather than around richer families that have a stronger birth order effect.
Okay. I just think this. I was just thinking that the whole question of the transmission, the direct transmission of the skills and apprenticeship, etc., and what you can see of that is just really interesting of a question of its own right that you could perhaps see with these data.
Yeah, definitely. I think that might have been the last thing that got added to the paper, and that's I think that is something that we should look in more detail, exactly what is how these things are transmitted there, definitely. But there might be also something above and beyond that transmission.
So are you accounting for in this transmission of occupation sort of whether or not it's a farm that's being handed down? Because I guess the transmitting the occupation of farmer seems to me like a very different case than transmitting the occupation of something that doesn't involve sort of a big asset that also is very complementary to the to the occupation also getting handed down.
Yeah, we've run the same regression without the farmers.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that I think we partially took into account as well is, given that we took the best occupation that anybody reported, if you inherit at some point the farm, because we can tell apart people that have their own land and people that don't.
Mm.
And then obviously they have the very different rankings.
Yeah.
So if you have at any point before you have your last connection with the register, inherit a farm, you will be a farmer for us. And when we took those out, we still see the same transmission.
That's
So
interesting.
it is not, it is not the same. It is not driven by farmers transmitting a piece of land. That is something that is, obviously, I'm sure they transmitted the know-how as well. But the assets, the pure inheritance route, that is very different than for other occupations. You're absolutely correct there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I was also a little bit curious about the last-born effect and how it was sort of very concentrated among those at the bottom percentiles. Do you have any sort of inkling about the mechanism for that? Is it sort of just the family has surplus food after the last-born child is born, and then families that are very constrained by the amount of food that they have are more likely to display this effect? Or
I think there might be something along those lines going on there. They appear in families that, in all likelihood, were constrained in making investment. Investment mean further education, as literacy was already very high there, other type of apprenticeship, all these type of investments. So obviously families that were very constrained, they seem to be very constrained even at the beginning. So the firstborn did not seem to get as much as a benefit. However, the lastborn, that looked like the competition for resources was not there anymore, because potentially the siblings have either left the household or they're bringing their own income as well, which is something that we also observe in this, what we observe a lot in developing countries, that instead of the firstborn going to do great things, what happens is the firstborn goes to work, leaves school and goes to work, and then the last one takes benefits from all these things in a way that allows them to go to school. So this is a bit more what we observe in developing countries. Even within family, in very similar setup to what we have in this paper, we observe people later in the family being sent to school mostly for a longer period of time, because they benefit not only from having less competition, but potentially from earlier siblings have to go to work. So I think potentially these families that are more constrained are gonna experience this process with a bit higher probability.
was there? I don't suppose that there was any sort of family planning along the years that are observed in your data set, right?
It's hard to know. I think with my reading of historical Dutch literature, which majoritarily is in Dutch, a bit of my ability, there seems to report certain difference by religion, particularly in the number of children that they had. I think quite maybe counterintuitive. If I remember correctly, they report Catholics marrying later and as such having less children than Protestant. But how this lower number of children other than later marriage was achieved, I'm not very sure how that did work.
Yeah. Stephen, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I'll even put a video on, since we always complain about the students not putting videos on, so we should do the same. I was just wondering, and it kind of relates to what you were talking about a bit earlier with other Stephen. So there's this argument, right, in developing context, right? You can take these two arguments, right? You can say, hey, you know, we put all of our apples in the firstborn, we push them, we try to get them to have money, that way they give money back into the family, that way all the siblings in the family benefit from it. And then there's the other side that says, okay, no, we get them to work as fast as possible, and hopefully, you know, or the education at first, you bank on the first, in this first case. The second one, you get them to work as fast as possible, everyone might benefit because more people in the family might benefit, more people are working. And to a certain extent, kind of there's this literature that's been coming out about like the fact that the rich have been the rich for 400, 500 years, right? The Medicis, if you were linked to the Medicis in Italy, you're good in 2021. But I mean, I don't know, but I think there's a lot less that actually kind of can test strategies of upward mobility. And you have a data set here where you can kind of follow generations. And it might be really interesting to kind of just, even if it's not purely causal, but more sort of almost descriptive, do the families that invest into the firstborn end up going upwards in ranking? Do the families, so these different testing kind of these different strategies that one might have in terms of investment of children and seeing which one actually lifts you up in the rankings over generations. Like that would be, to me, a super fascinating paper, which you might be able to do. But
yeah, maybe, at some point with different data, we were looking at the birth order of the birth order. So having a father that is the firstborn benefited you, even if you were not the firstborn. But it is true that maybe that have some exploratory numbers there that didn't amount to much. But it is true that maybe the way to go would have been to look this, particularly in the light of these results, by strategy, let's say, right? Whether you were a kind of firstborn type of family, or a lastborn type of family. Because obviously only the birth order of the birth order will give you an average that may give you halfway. So yeah, that's definitely something we should go back to and see if we can. Obviously, there is the limitations that there's no source of exogeneity and things like that, but definitely that's something we can go back and have another look at. Yeah, thanks for that.
You know, thanks a lot. Thank you.
So we're right up on 4 o'clock. I don't know if there's just a really quick question out there. If not, then I'd like to thank Anna for a really interesting presentation, and thanks everyone for showing up and contributing. We will be back next week, and otherwise have a great afternoon, everyone. And thanks especially, Anna.
Thank you, everybody. This was great.
Thanks, Anna.